Ayanna Redwolf's hands trembled as she gripped the white lace of her mother's wedding dress, her father's weathered face stone cold behind her in the cracked mirror. The church bells weren't ringing in celebration, they were tolling like a funeral dirge. This wasn't the wedding she'd dreamed of with Tommy Running Bear. Elder Whitehawk's voice cracked as he pronounced her married to the silent mountain man standing rigid as a tombstone beside her, his dark eyes revealing nothing while her belly, 3 months swollen with another man's child, pressed against the confining fabric. Sarah Whitehawk gasped from the front pew, her hand flying to cover her mouth as the reality struck the congregation like a physical blow. The woman who delivered half the babies in Silver Creek knew exactly what she was witnessing. Chief Nathaniel Redwolf's jaw tightened, his fingers white-knuckled around his hat brim, torn between a father's desperate love and a rancher's brutal pragmatism. "You will survive this," he whispered to his daughter, though his voice broke like kindling. But who was this Dakota Stormcloud, and why had her father chosen him? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Colorado Territory stretched endlessly beyond Silver Creek, where the remnants of the gold rush still clung to life like autumn leaves refusing to fall. In 1885, the mountains held both promise and peril, their peaks crowned with snow even in late summer, casting long shadows over dreams that had turned to dust in too many miners' hands. Chief Nathaniel Redwolf had built his empire from nothing, transforming 5,000 acres of raw wilderness into the most prosperous ranch between Denver and Durango. His Cherokee blood ran strong through weathered hands that had never known defeat, but his Scottish pragmatism kept the ledgers balanced and the cattle fed. The massive log house that crowned Redwolf Ranch stood as testament to a man who refused to be broken by either prejudice or poverty. But empires built on borrowed time have a way of crumbling, and the eastern banks were circling like vultures over carrion. Ayanna Redwolf possessed her father's iron will wrapped in her late mother's gentle grace. At 18, she carried herself with the dignity of Cherokee royalty and the education of a Denver finishing school. Her dark hair caught sunlight like raven wings, and her eyes held depths that spoke of old wisdom and new dreams. She'd planned to teach the children of Silver Creek, to bridge the gap between the old ways and the new world pressing in from all sides. Those dreams died with Tommy Running Bear in the collapsed silver mine 2 months ago, buried under tons of rock and broken promises. Tommy had been everything her father despised, poor, idealistic, and foolishly honest. A full-blooded Lakota who'd chosen love over tribal politics, he'd worked the dangerous deep shafts to save enough money for a proper wedding. His calloused hands had been gentle when he'd promised Ayanna a future built on more than land deeds and cattle brands. He'd spoken of children who would know both their heritage and their possibilities, of a love that could weather any storm. Instead, the mountain had claimed him, leaving only memories and the growing secret beneath Ayanna's heart. 8 miles up Devil's Ridge, where the air thinned and civilized men feared to tread, Dakota Stormcloud lived in isolation that bordered on legend. The townspeople whispered stories of his violence, his hatred of visitors, his mysterious past that no one dared investigate too closely. Some said he'd been a soldier gone mad. Others claimed he was running from justice back east. What they didn't know was that Dakota Stormcloud was a man drowning in ghosts, holding secrets that could save lives or destroy them. His cabin, built with surgeon's precision rather than settler's haste, overlooked a valley where eagles soared and ancient spirits still walked. For 10 years, he'd chosen solitude over society, silence over explanation. He'd forgotten what it felt like to hope for tomorrow, until a desperate father appeared at his door with an offer that would change everything. marry a pregnant girl, and save them all from ruin. The morning sickness had betrayed Ayanna's secret on a Tuesday that dawned deceptively peaceful. Sarah Whitehawk found her retching behind the schoolhouse where she'd been preparing lesson plans for children who would never be her students. The older woman's knowing eyes had taken in the pale complexion, the tender way Ayanna held her stomach, the telltale signs that no midwife could miss. "How far along, child?" Sarah had asked gently, her weathered hands steady as she helped Ayanna to her feet. 3 months, Ayanna whispered, the words falling like stones into still water. "Since before Tommy died." The secret spread through Silver Creek like wildfire through dry grass. By sunset, half the town knew that Chief Red Wolf's daughter carried a dead man's baby. By the following dawn, the whispers had reached the wrong ears, and the right ones. Chief Nathaniel Red Wolf stood in his study, staring at the stack of overdue notices that had arrived with the morning mail. The elegant script of Eastern bankers mocked him from cream-colored paper, each document a nail in his coffin. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in 60 days unless he could produce $20,000, a sum that might as well have been 20 million. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd spent his life accumulating wealth to protect his family had been brought low by the very thing he'd tried to prevent, poverty's cruel arithmetic. When Ayanna finally came to him, her chin raised in defiance but her hands trembling with fear, Nathaniel felt his heart shatter and calcify simultaneously. "I won't apologize for loving him," she said, standing before his massive desk like a defendant before a judge. "Tommy was a good man." "Good men don't leave children fatherless," Nathaniel replied, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. He'd seen Tommy's body pulled from the mine, seen the desperate love in the boy's eyes whenever he'd looked at Ayanna. The young man had died trying to build a future worthy of her. "He didn't choose to die, Father, but he chose to be poor." The cruel words escaped before Nathaniel could stop them, and he watched his daughter flinch as if he'd struck her. "Do you know what poverty does to women like your mother? Do you understand what killed her?" Ayanna's eyes flashed with inherited fire. "Mother died because the doctor was drunk, not because we were poor." "Your mother died because I couldn't afford the best doctor in Denver. Because I couldn't pay for the medicine she needed, the specialist who might have saved her." Nathaniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "I won't watch poverty kill you too." For 3 sleepless nights, Nathaniel wrestled with choices that felt like choosing between different types of damnation. He could let Ayanna face motherhood alone, watch her struggle as an unwed mother in a territory that showed little mercy to fallen women. He could send her away to distant relatives, lose her forever to eastern cities and foreign customs. Or he could find her a husband, someone strong enough to protect her, wealthy enough to provide for her, isolated enough to accept damaged goods. The answer came to him like a revelation born of desperation. Dakota Stormcloud lived beyond society's reach, beyond its judgment and its gossip. The man's reputation for violence might be exaggerated, but his self-sufficiency was legendary. Mountain men survived where civilized men perished. More importantly, Dakota was a mystery, and mysteries could be solved if a man was desperate enough to try. The ride up Devil's Ridge took 4 hours through terrain that would have killed a lesser horseman. Nathaniel's mount picked its way carefully along trails that disappeared into sheer drops, past stands of aspen that whispered secrets in languages older than memory. When he finally reached the cabin, he found Dakota Stormcloud splitting wood with the mechanical precision of a man who'd long since stopped expecting company. "I need to speak with you," Nathaniel called out, staying mounted and keeping his hands visible. Mountain men were notorious for shooting first and asking questions later. Dakota straightened slowly, the axe still in his hands. He was taller than the stories claimed, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that spoke of controlled power rather than laziness. His dark eyes evaluated Nathaniel with the dispassionate calculation of a predator sizing up potential prey. "Speak your piece and ride out," Dakota said, his voice carrying the faint accent of formal education beneath the rough mountain vernacular. Nathaniel took a deep breath and gambled everything on one desperate throw of the dice. "I have a daughter. She's with child and needs a husband. I'm prepared to pay $2,000 to the man who'll take her." Dakota's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. What's wrong with her? Nothing that can't be fixed with distance and time. "And what's wrong with you that you'd sell your daughter to a stranger?" Nathaniel felt the truth scrape his throat raw. "I'm a desperate father who'd rather see her alive and unhappy than dead and pure." Dakota studied him for a long moment, then sank the axe into the chopping block with finality. "I'll take her." The wedding took place on a Thursday morning when the mountain mist still clung to Silver Creek like unspoken regrets. Elder Joseph Whitehawk had agreed to perform the ceremony with reluctance etched into every line of his weathered face, understanding that some unions were born of necessity rather than love. The small church held perhaps 30 souls, most of them drawn by curiosity rather than celebration. Ayanna stood at the altar in her mother's ivory silk dress, the fabric whispering against her skin like ghost fingers. The gown had been taken out twice to accommodate her changing figure, each alteration a reminder of the life growing within her. Her hands remained steady as she spoke the vows that would bind her to a stranger, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Dakota Stormcloud cut an imposing figure beside her, his dark suit probably borrowed from someone in town, his long black hair pulled back in a way that emphasized the sharp angles of his face. When he spoke the sacred words, his voice carried no emotion, neither happiness nor resentment, just the flat acceptance of a man fulfilling a contract. "You may kiss the bride," Elder Whitehawk intoned, and Dakota leaned down to brush his lips against Ayanna's forehead with surprising gentleness. The gesture felt more like a blessing than a claiming. The ride to Dakota's cabin stretched before them like a journey into another world. 2 horses picked their way carefully up the winding mountain trail, Dakota leading on a black gelding while Ayanna followed on a gentle mare her father had chosen for its steady temperament. Her wedding dress had been exchanged for practical traveling clothes, leather skirt, woolen blouse, and boots sturdy enough for mountain terrain. Neither spoke during the ascent. The silence wasn't hostile, merely careful, like 2 wild animals circling each other to determine threat levels. Ayanna found herself studying her new husband's broad shoulders, the easy way he sat his horse, the unconscious authority with which he navigated treacherous switchbacks. Whatever else Dakota Stormcloud might be, he was clearly master of this harsh landscape. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and cooler. Aspen groves gave way to pine forests, their dark branches reaching toward a sky that seemed close enough to touch. Eagles wheeled overhead, their cries echoing off granite cliffs that had witnessed countless generations of human struggle. This was country that demanded respect, that killed the careless and humbled the proud. The cabin materialized through the trees like something from a fairy tale, not the rough shanty Ayanna had expected, but a substantial log structure with glass windows and a stone chimney that spoke of permanence. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, offering views of valleys that stretched to the horizon. Nearby, a creek chattered over smooth stones, its voice a constant whisper of moving water. Dakota dismounted first, then moved to help Ayanna down from her horse. His hands on her waist were brief, impersonal, but she caught a glimpse of calluses that spoke of hard work rather than mere wilderness survival. Up close, she noticed details that the church's dim lighting had hidden. the careful way he'd shaved for the ceremony, the fact that his nails were clean and trimmed, the faint scent of soap that clung to his skin. "The cabin has 2 rooms," he said, leading her toward the front door. "You'll take the bedroom. I'll sleep on the porch until I can build an addition." Ayanna paused on the threshold, suddenly understanding that this man intended to give her privacy, space, dignity, things she hadn't dared hope for. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." Dakota's voice carried quiet conviction. "A woman in your condition needs rest and peace. I won't be the one to deny you either." Inside, the cabin revealed itself as surprisingly civilized. Books lined makeshift shelves, their leather bindings well worn from use. The furniture was handmade but skillfully crafted, each piece showing attention to detail that went beyond mere functionality. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, already laid with kindling, as if Dakota had prepared for their arrival. But it was the small things that caught Ayanna's attention. Wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, fresh bread wrapped in clean cloth, extra blankets folded on a chair near the fireplace. Someone had taken care to make this place welcoming, and she found herself wondering if her new husband possessed depths that his reputation didn't suggest. That first night, as promised, Dakota slept on the porch while Ayanna lay awake in the comfortable bed, listening to unfamiliar sounds of wilderness, settling into darkness. Through the window she could see stars in quantities impossible to view from town, their cold light offering neither comfort nor condemnation. She was married now, bound to a man she didn't know and couldn't read. But for the first time since Tommy's death, she wasn't alone. The first week passed in careful choreography of avoidance and necessity. Dakota left before dawn each morning, returning at dusk with game or firewood or wild herbs that he hung in bundles from the porch rafters. Ayanna spent her days exploring the cabin's modest interior, organizing supplies with the methodical precision of a woman trying to impose order on an impossible situation. She discovered that Dakota owned more books than the Silver Creek schoolhouse, volumes on medicine, philosophy, and natural history mixed with well-thumbed copies of Shakespeare and Whitman. The medical texts puzzled her most. Mountain men weren't known for their scholarly pursuits, yet these books showed signs of intensive study, with careful notes penciled in margins and passages underlined in fading ink. On the 3rd morning, Ayanna woke to find a wooden chair positioned outside the bedroom door, a cup of sassafras tea steaming on its seat. Dakota had already disappeared into the forest, but the gesture spoke of consideration that surprised her. The tea was perfectly prepared, sweetened with wild honey, and strong enough to settle her queasy stomach. When he returned that evening with 2 rabbits and a handful of late-season berries, she thanked him for the kindness. Dakota merely nodded, as if providing for a pregnant woman's needs required no acknowledgement. But she caught him watching her face as she sipped the tea, noting her reaction with the focused attention of someone accustomed to observing details. "You know about morning sickness," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. "I know about a lot of things." Dakota's voice carried no boast, just simple fact. "Doesn't mean I know what matters." The cryptic response left Ayanna with more questions than answers, but she was learning that direct inquiry yielded little with her taciturn husband. Information about Dakota Stormcloud would have to be gathered like breadcrumbs, one careful observation at a time. By the 2nd week, they'd settled into routines that allowed them to share space without awkwardness. Dakota continued sleeping on the porch despite increasingly cool nights, rising before Ayanna to build up the fire and start coffee. She took over cooking duties, grateful for tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. Her pregnancy symptoms were intensifying. Waves of nausea that left her weak and dizzy, and exhaustion that seemed to seep into her bones. It was on a Tuesday morning that everything changed. Ayanna had been hanging laundry on the line Dakota had strung between two pine trees when the world suddenly tilted sideways. Pain lanced through her abdomen like a red-hot knife, doubling her over with such force that she dropped the wet shirt she'd been pinning to the rope. The cramping intensified, accompanied by a warm wetness between her legs that terrified her more than any physical agony. "No," she whispered, one hand pressed to her belly while the other gripped the laundry line for support. "Please, not my baby." Blood stained her skirt, not the bright red of fresh injury, but the dark, threatening flow that every woman feared. Ayanna sank to her knees in the pine needles, panic overwhelming pain as she realized she might be losing the only piece of Tommy she had left. Dakota appeared as if summoned by her distress, dropping the armload of firewood he'd been carrying. One look at her condition galvanized him into action with a speed and efficiency that transformed him before her eyes. Gone was the laconic mountain man. In his place stood someone with unmistakable medical authority. "How long have you been bleeding?" His voice remained calm, but his hands moved with practiced precision as he helped her to her feet. "Just started," Ayanna gasped, leaning heavily against his strength. "The pain came first, then inside, now." Dakota swept her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing, carrying her through the cabin door with controlled urgency. He placed her carefully on the bed, then moved to light several oil lamps despite the morning hour. "I need to examine you. Do you trust me?" Ayanna met his eyes and saw something there that the past weeks had only hinted at: competence born of knowledge, authority earned through experience. "You're a doctor." "Was." Dakota's hands were already gathering supplies: clean cloths, a basin of water, instruments she hadn't noticed among his possessions. "Long time ago. Right now, I'm the only chance your baby has." The examination was thorough and surprisingly gentle, conducted with a professionalism that answered many of Ayanna's questions about her enigmatic husband. Dakota's touch was impersonal, but reassuring, his questions precise and targeted. When he finally sat back, his expression was cautiously optimistic. "The bleeding's not as bad as it looks," he said, covering her with a clean blanket. "The cervix is still closed, which means the pregnancy is likely viable, but you need complete bed rest for at least a week, possibly longer." Ayanna felt tears of relief burning her eyes. "The baby's all right?" "For now." Dakota's honesty was both brutal and comforting. "These early bleeds can be dangerous, but they don't always mean miscarriage. Your body's under stress, the wedding, the move, the emotional upheaval. Sometimes pregnancy rebels against too much change too quickly." "How do you know so much about childbirth?" Ayanna asked, studying his face for clues to the mystery he represented. Dakota was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "I specialized in obstetrics and gynecology at Harvard Medical School. Graduated in 1875, practiced in Boston for 3 years before the war came calling." The revelation hit Ayanna like a physical blow. Harvard Medical School, one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. Dakota Stormcloud wasn't just educated, he was elite, brilliant, trained in exactly the skills her crisis demanded. "What brought you here?" "Bad choices and good intentions." Dakota began cleaning his instruments with methodical care. "The Army needed doctors for the Indian campaigns. I thought I could make a difference, help negotiate peaceful solutions to medical problems on both sides." "What happened?" Dakota's hands stilled for a moment. "I learned that some problems don't have medical solutions, and some differences can't be negotiated." Over the following days, as Ayanna remained confined to bed per Dakota's strict orders, she began to piece together fragments of her husband's story. He'd served as a field surgeon during some of the bloodiest conflicts between cavalry and tribal warriors. treating wounds inflicted by both sides while watching political stupidity destroy any hope of lasting peace. The medical crisis had revealed Dakota's true nature, not the savage hermit of local legend, but a man of science and compassion who'd retreated to the mountains to heal wounds that had nothing to do with flesh and bone. His hands, when they checked her pulse or adjusted her pillows, carried the gentle authority of someone accustomed to easing suffering. "Why did you agree to marry me?" Ayanna asked one evening as Dakota brought her dinner on a wooden tray he'd carved himself. "Your father offered me $2,000. "That's not the real reason." Dakota considered her words while cutting her meat into manageable pieces, another small kindness that spoke of ingrained consideration. "Your father told me you were pregnant and needed a husband. He didn't tell me you were mourning the father or that you'd been forced into this arrangement. Would it have mattered? Maybe." Dakota met her eyes directly. "I've spent 10 years avoiding human connections because they're complicated and painful. But I've also spent 10 years remembering every patient I couldn't save, every woman who died because good medical care wasn't available when she needed it. The implication hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Ayanna had been sent to him as merchandise, but Dakota was treating her as a patient worthy of his best skills and deepest care. "What's your real name?" she asked. "Dakota Stormcloud is real enough. My birth name was David Sterling, but that man died in a cavalry camp outside Fort Robinson. The man who came down from these mountains to marry you is someone different. Someone better or someone worse. Someone honest, maybe." The war taught me that healing and killing sometimes look identical until you know the intention behind the action. I chose healing, even when it meant healing my enemies. As the days passed and Ayanna's condition stabilized, their conversations grew longer and more revealing. Dakota possessed a scholar's mind trapped in a warrior's body, his insights into human nature sharpened by years of treating people at their most vulnerable moments. He spoke of medical discoveries being made in Eastern hospitals, of surgical techniques that could save lives if properly applied, of the frustrating gap between what was possible and what was available on the frontier. Ayanna found herself sharing memories of Tommy, not the idealized saint her grief had created, but the real man with dreams that outstripped his circumstances and love that transcended social boundaries. She told Dakota about her mother's death, about the guilt that had shaped her father's protective instincts, about her own dreams of teaching and the way those dreams had been buried along with her childhood. "Dreams don't die easily," Dakota observed, his hands gentle as he checked the steadiness of her pulse. "They just go underground for a while, waiting for the right conditions to grow again. Some dreams are impossible. Some dreams just require different soil." The bleeding stopped completely after 5 days, and Dakota gradually allowed Ayanna to resume light activities. She watched him work around the cabin with new understanding, recognizing the trained surgeon in the way he organized his tools, the scientist in his careful observation of weather patterns and animal behavior, the healer in his instinctive response to any sign of distress. But she also saw the isolation's toll, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence as if remembering he wasn't alone, the careful distance he maintained even during their most intimate conversations, the shadows that crossed his face when he thought she wasn't watching. Dakota Stormcloud had saved her baby's life, but she was beginning to wonder who would save his. On the morning she felt the baby's first flutter of movement, barely a whisper of sensation, but unmistakably life asserting itself. Ayanna called Dakota to place his hand on her belly. His palm was warm and steady, his fingers positioned with clinical precision to detect the faint motions of new life. When he felt the tiny kick, his face transformed with an expression of wonder that years of warfare and heartbreak hadn't quite extinguished. "Strong," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Going to be a fighter," Like his parents, Ayanna said, then realized she'd included Dakota in that calculation without conscious thought. Dakota's hand remained on her belly for a long moment, and she wondered if he was remembering other babies he'd helped deliver, other women he'd guided through pregnancy's treacherous waters. When he finally looked up, his dark eyes held a vulnerability that made her breath catch. "I'll keep you both safe," he said, the promise carrying weight of absolute commitment, whatever it costs. Ayanna believed him, and that belief frightened her more than any physical danger, because she was beginning to understand that loving Dakota Stormcloud would be the easiest thing in the world, and possibly the most dangerous. The confrontation arrived on a crisp October morning when the aspen leaves had turned gold and the air carried the sharp promise of winter. Ayanna was hanging herbs to dry in the cabin's eaves when she heard the thunder of approaching hooves, too many horses moving too fast up the treacherous mountain trail. Her hand stilled on the bundle of sage she'd been tying, her 4-month pregnancy evident beneath the loose folds of her woolen dress. Dakota emerged from the forest where he'd been checking trap lines, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. One look at his face told Ayanna he'd recognized the sound as surely as she had. This wasn't a social visit. This was trouble arriving in force. "Get inside," he said quietly, dropping the rabbits and moving toward the cabin with predatory grace. "Stay away from the windows." Chief Nathaniel Red Wolf rode at the head of 8 mounted men, his face carved from granite and his eyes holding the cold fury of a father convinced his daughter was in mortal danger. Sheriff William Blackfoot flanked him on the right, his hand resting casually on his service revolver. Dr. Marcus Goldfeather rode to the left, his medical bag strapped securely behind his saddle. The remaining men were ranchers and townspeople from Silver Creek, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. They formed a semicircle in front of the cabin, horses snorting and stamping in the thin mountain air. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, while Dakota stood motionless on his porch, showing no more concern than if they'd been a flock of migrating geese. "We've come for my daughter," Chief Red Wolf announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. "Reports have reached town about her condition. Doctor. Goldfeather needs to examine her." "She's my wife," Dakota replied, his tone conversational despite the obvious tension. "Any medical concerns can be addressed through her husband." Dr. Goldfeather urged his horse forward, his round face flushed with righteous indignation. "Sir, with all due respect, you are not qualified to tend to a woman in her delicate condition. The reports we've received suggest she's been bleeding, possibly miscarrying. She needs proper medical attention." Something flickered in Dakota's dark eyes, surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "And what makes you think I'm not qualified to tend my own wife?" "Because you're a mountain man," Sheriff Blackfoot interjected, his voice heavy with contempt. "What do you know about birthing babies or women's medicine? We're taking her back to town where she belongs." The transformation in Dakota was subtle but unmistakable. His posture shifted slightly, shoulders squaring in a way that spoke of formal training rather than wilderness instinct. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new authority that made several horses shy nervously. "I know enough to diagnose placental abruption from normal pregnancy bleeding. I know enough to distinguish between threatened abortion and inevitable abortion based on cervical examination. I know enough to prescribe complete bed rest and monitor fetal heart tones using manual palpation techniques." His medical terminology fell like hammer blows in the crisp air. "What exactly do you know, Dr. Goldfeather?" The portly doctor's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror. "Good God," he whispered. "You're Dakota Stormcloud, David Sterling, the Harvard man." Chief Red Wolf's horse pranced restlessly beneath him as the implications registered. "What the hell are you talking about, Marcus?" "Doctor, Goldfeather's voice shook as he addressed the group. "Gentlemen, this man is Dr. David Sterling, graduated Harvard Medical School with highest honors in 1875. He specialized in obstetrics and gynecology, published papers on prenatal care that are still cited in medical journals. He was considered one of the most promising young physicians in New England before he disappeared into the Army Medical Corps." The revelation hit the assembled men like a physical blow. Sheriff Blackfoot's hand moved away from his weapon as if it had suddenly become red hot. The ranchers exchanged uncertain glances, their certainty about the situation evaporating like morning mist. Chief Red Wolf, however, was made of sterner stuff. "I don't care if you're the Surgeon General himself," he snarled. "You bought my daughter like livestock. You're holding her prisoner in this God-forsaken wilderness. She's coming home with me." "No." The voice came from behind Dakota, soft but carrying absolute conviction. Ayanna stepped onto the porch, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly, her dark eyes blazing with inherited fire. "I'm not going anywhere." The sight of his daughter, visibly pregnant, standing beside the man he'd paid to take her, nearly broke Nathaniel's composure. "Ayanna, you don't understand what you're saying. This isn't your choice to make." "It's exactly my choice to make." Ayanna moved to stand beside Dakota, close enough that their shoulders touched in a gesture of unity that wasn't lost on the watching men. "I'm a married woman carrying my husband's child. My place is here." "His child?" Chief Red Wolf's voice cracked like a whip. "That baby belongs to Tommy Running Bear, and every man here knows it." Dakota's hand found Ayanna's, their fingers interlacing with natural ease. When he spoke, his voice carried quiet conviction that cut through the mountain air like a blade. "Blood doesn't make a father. Choice does. This child will know no father but me, and I'll know no child but this one." Dr. Goldfeather cleared his throat nervously. "Dr. Sterling, Dakota, perhaps we could speak privately. There are questions about your circumstances that need addressing." "Speak your piece here," Dakota replied. "My wife deserves to hear whatever accusations you're planning to make." "There were rumors," Dr. Goldfeather began hesitantly, "about why you left your practice so suddenly, about a patient who died under questionable circumstances, about investigations into your conduct." The words hung in the air like poison, and Ayanna felt Dakota's hand tighten on hers. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady. "Sarah Whitmore Red Wolf died in childbirth on March 15, 1878, he said, his eyes fixed on Chief Red Wolf's face. "She hemorrhaged during delivery despite every intervention I attempted. The investigation concluded that her death was due to complications beyond any physician's ability to prevent." Chief Red Wolf went white as fresh snow. You were Sarah's doctor?" "I was the specialist your husband brought from Denver when the local physician declared the case hopeless," Dakota continued remorselessly. "I spent 3 days trying to save her life. I failed." The admission fell like a thunderbolt among the assembled men. Chief Red Wolf swayed in his saddle as if struck by a physical blow, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and devastating comprehension. "You knew," he whispered, "when I came to you with my offer. You knew who I was." "I knew," Dakota confirmed. "I also knew that Ayanna had inherited her mother's pelvic configuration, which put her at high risk for the same complications. Marrying her wasn't about your money, Nathaniel. It was about making sure she didn't die the way her mother did." Sheriff Blackfoot found his voice first. "You're saying this whole arrangement was, what, some kind of medical intervention?" "I'm saying a desperate father found a way to put his daughter under the care of the one physician in the territory with experience treating her specific condition," Dakota replied. "Whether he fully understood his own motivations is between him and his conscience." Ayanna stared at her father with new understanding dawning in her dark eyes. "You didn't sell me," she said slowly. "You saved me." Chief Red Wolf's face crumpled as years of guilt and desperate love finally found voice. "I couldn't lose you the way I lost her," he said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't watch you die from the same thing that killed your mother. When I heard about Dr. Sterling living in these mountains, when I learned he was the one who'd tried to save Sarah, I thought maybe God was giving me a second chance to do right by my family." Dr. Goldfeather shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "The question remains whether Dr. Sterling is mentally competent to practice medicine after his experiences with the Army Medical Corps." Dakota's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "You want to test my competence, Marcus? Your wife's expecting her 5th child. Based on her age and obstetric history, I'd estimate she's at significant risk for placenta previa. Has she experienced any bleeding in the 3rd trimester?" Dr. Goldfeather's face went pale. "How could you possibly know?" "Because I've been observing her gait and posture when I've seen her in town. Because I recognize the signs of a woman carrying a baby positioned abnormally low. Because unlike you, I've actually delivered more than a dozen babies and know what to look for." Dakota's voice carried cutting precision. "When she starts bleeding, and she will, bring her to me, because you're not qualified to handle the surgery she's going to need." The brutal assessment left Dr. Goldfeather speechless and several of the other men distinctly uncomfortable. The mountain man they'd come to rescue Ayanna from was clearly more qualified to practice medicine than anyone within 100 miles. Sheriff Blackfoot cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should let the lady speak for herself. Ayanna, are you here of your own free will?" Ayanna looked at each man in turn, then at Dakota standing beside her with his secrets finally laid bare. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of a woman who'd found her strength in the most unlikely place. "I am here because this is where I choose to be," she said. "My husband saved my baby's life, and he may very well save mine when the time comes. You came here thinking you were rescuing me from a savage, but you're really trying to take me away from the most civilized man I've ever known." She paused, her free hand moving to rest on her belly, where new life grew strong and safe. "I'm grateful for your concern, but my place is here. My family is here, and I'll thank you not to interfere with my marriage again." The finality in her voice left no room for argument, and one by one, the men began to understand that they were the intruders in this place, not Dakota Stormcloud. The first blizzard of winter struck with the vengeance of an ancient god, trapping all 9 men at Dakota's cabin as temperatures plummeted and snow fell in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. What had begun as a tense confrontation transformed into a desperate struggle for survival as the mountain demonstrated its absolute indifference to human conflict. Chief Red Wolf stood at the cabin's single window, watching the world disappear behind a curtain of white fury. "I've seen bad storms, but nothing like this," he muttered, his breath fogging the glass. "We should have started back hours ago." "No one's going anywhere until this passes," Dakota said, stoking the fire to keep pace with the plummeting temperature. "Could last 3 days, maybe more. We'll need to ration food and conserve firewood." The cabin, designed for 2 people, now sheltered 9 adults in conditions that would have tested the patience of saints. Men who'd arrived as adversaries found themselves forced into intimate proximity, sharing warmth and breath in the small space while the storm raged outside with primal fury. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped so severely that ice formed on the inside of the windows. The men huddled around the fireplace, wrapped in every available blanket and buffalo hide, their earlier animosity forgotten in the face of nature's indiscriminate threat. Dakota moved among them with quiet efficiency, checking for signs of frostbite and hypothermia with the practiced eye of someone who understood the mountain's lethal capabilities. It was Sheriff Blackfoot who noticed the change in Chief Red Wolf first. The older man had grown increasingly pale as the evening progressed, his breathing becoming labored and shallow. When he tried to stand and immediately clutched his chest with a strangled gasp, Dakota was beside him before he hit the floor. "Heart attack," Dakota diagnosed grimly, his fingers finding the pulse point at Nathaniel's throat. The rhythm was erratic, weak, the beat of a heart struggling against overwhelming strain. "We need to get him lying flat, feet elevated." Dr. Goldfeather scrambled forward, his face flushed with panic. "What can we do? My medical bag is limited, and in these conditions—" "Your bag won't help," Dakota said curtly, already loosening Nathaniel's collar and positioning him for optimal circulation. "This isn't about medication. It's about keeping him alive until his heart stabilizes." Ayanna knelt beside her father, tears freezing on her cheeks as she took his hand. His skin was gray and clammy, his eyes unfocused with pain. "Papa," she whispered, the childhood endearment slipping out unbidden. "Don't you dare leave me. Not now." Nathaniel's lips moved soundlessly, his grip on her hand weak but determined. Dakota worked with calm precision, monitoring vital signs and adjusting Nathaniel's position to ease the strain on his struggling heart. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the chief's condition was deteriorating despite their efforts. "He's not responding," Dr. Goldfeather said quietly, pulling Dakota aside. "His pulse is getting weaker. Without proper cardiac medications, I don't think—" "He's dying," Dakota finished flatly. "His heart's giving out under the stress." The brutal assessment hung in the air like a death sentence. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, making evacuation impossible even if they'd had somewhere to go. Chief Nathaniel Red Wolf, who'd survived poverty, prejudice, and the building of an empire, was going to die on his son-in-law's cabin floor. That's when Ayanna's labor pains began. The first contraction hit like a lightning strike, doubling her over with agony so intense she couldn't breathe. Dakota spun toward her, his face going white as he realized what was happening. "No," he breathed. "It's too early. She's only 6 months along." Dr. Goldfeather looked between the dying man and the woman going into premature labor, his round face crumpling with the weight of impossible choices. "We can't handle both cases simultaneously, not in these conditions." "We don't have a choice," Dakota said grimly, moving to Ayanna's side as another contraction racked her body. "Sheriff, I need you to monitor Chief Red Wolf's breathing. Count his pulse every 5 minutes and call out any changes. Dr. Goldfeather, gather every clean cloth in this cabin. We're going to need them." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Dakota worked with the focused intensity of a man fighting 2 battles simultaneously, dividing his attention between Nathaniel's failing heart and Ayanna's premature labor. The other men followed his orders without question. Their earlier skepticism about his abilities evaporated in the face of crisis. Chief Red Wolf slipped in and out of consciousness, his breathing growing more labored with each passing hour. During his lucid moments, he called for Ayanna, desperate to speak words that might be his last. But Ayanna was lost in the primitive struggle of childbirth, her body racked by contractions that came too soon and too strong. "The baby's coming," Dakota announced, his voice tight with controlled fear. 2 months premature. Even if the delivery goes perfectly, the infant's survival chances are minimal." "Save my daughter," Nathaniel whispered from his makeshift bed near the fire. "Let me go, but save her." "I'm not letting anyone die tonight," Dakota replied with fierce determination. "Not if I can prevent it." As dawn broke gray and cold through the continuing storm, Ayanna gave one final agonizing push and brought her son into the world. The baby emerged blue and silent, so tiny he could fit in Dakota's cupped hands. For a terrifying moment, the cabin fell completely silent except for the storm's howling. Then Dakota cleared the infant's airways with practiced efficiency, and the cabin filled with the thin, reedy cry of premature life asserting itself against overwhelming odds. The baby was alive, but barely, his breathing rapid and shallow, his temperature dangerously low. "He needs constant warmth," Dakota said, wrapping the infant in heated blankets near the fire. "And Ayanna needs immediate attention. She's hemorrhaging." The blood loss was significant, painting the makeshift delivery area crimson despite Dakota's efforts to control it. Ayanna's face was white as paper, her breathing shallow and rapid. Dakota worked with desperate efficiency, applying pressure and administering what limited medications he had available. But it was Chief Red Wolf who provided the miracle they needed. Somehow finding strength from reserves deeper than physical endurance, he struggled to his feet and moved to his daughter's side. His weathered hands, steadier than they'd been in hours, found her pulse point and began monitoring her vital signs with the instinctive knowledge of a father who'd already lost one woman to childbirth. "Her heart's strong," he reported, his voice gaining strength with purpose. "Pulse is rapid but steady. She's fighting." The crisis continued through the morning as Dakota battled to save both mother and child, while the storm raged outside with undiminished fury. The premature baby required constant attention, warming, feeding attempts with tiny amounts of milk expressed from Ayanna, monitoring for signs of respiratory distress. But gradually, impossibly, both patients began to stabilize. Ayanna's bleeding slowed and finally stopped. The baby's breathing became more regular, his color improving from blue to pale pink. And Chief Red Wolf, sustained by the desperate need to help save his family, found his own heart rhythm stabilizing as stress gave way to purposeful action. When the storm finally broke on the third day, revealing a world transformed by snow and ice, 3 generations of the same family lay sleeping near the fire. Grandfather, mother, and premature son, all clinging to life through sheer, stubborn will and Dakota's medical expertise. The mountain had tested them all and found them worthy of survival, but the real test of their character was just beginning. The truth emerged like spring water from stone, slowly at first, then in a rushing torrent that reshaped everything they thought they understood about duty, sacrifice, and the complex mathematics of love. Chief Nathaniel Red Wolf, his strength gradually returning as his heart found its rhythm again, sat propped against pillows near the fire where his grandson slept in a makeshift incubator Dakota had constructed from heated stones and carefully positioned blankets. The premature infant, no bigger than a sparrow but fierce with inherited determination, had survived his first 72 hours through constant vigilance and medical expertise that bordered on miraculous. "There's something you need to know," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice still weak but gaining conviction with each word, "about why I really came to you with that marriage proposal." Dakota looked up from where he was checking Ayanna's pulse, his dark eyes wary but attentive. Ayanna herself was awake now, though still pale and exhausted from the ordeal of premature labor. Her hand rested protectively near the basket, where her son fought his tiny battles for breath and warmth. Dr. Goldfeather shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing the weight of confession in the older man's tone. The other men had departed as soon as the trails became passable, carrying word back to Silver Creek that both mother and baby had survived against all odds. But Marcus had stayed, ostensibly to assist with medical care, actually because his conscience demanded he witness whatever revelation was coming. "I've been bankrupt for 8 months," Nathaniel continued, each word precisely measured. "The ranch, the cattle, everything mortgaged to Eastern banks that don't give a damn about drought or cattle prices or what happens to families when the numbers don't add up. I had 60 days to produce $20,000 or lose everything my wife and I built together." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sheriff Blackfoot, who'd also remained through the crisis, let out a low whistle of understanding. $20,000 represented more money than most men saw in a lifetime. "The bride price," Dakota said quietly. $2,000 wasn't payment for taking Ayanna. It was a down payment on saving the ranch. "No!" Nathaniel shook his head with surprising vehemence. "You don't understand. The $2,000 was never about the ranch. By the time I came to you, I'd already accepted that we'd lose the land. The money was for something else entirely." Ayanna struggled to sit up straighter, her face pale but her eyes burning with the need to understand. "What are you talking about, Papa?" Nathaniel's weathered hands trembled as he reached for a leather portfolio that had somehow survived the chaos of the past few days. From it, he withdrew a collection of papers, letters, medical records, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. "Your mother didn't die from childbirth complications," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She died because I couldn't afford the specialist who might have saved her. The doctor who had the skills and experience to handle difficult pregnancies was in Denver, charging fees that might as well have been the moon and stars." Dr. Goldfeather's face went white as understanding dawned. "You're talking about Dr. David Sterling, the Harvard man. Even back then, his reputation—" "He was the best," Nathaniel confirmed, "and the most expensive. I spent everything we had trying to bring him to Silver Creek, but by the time I'd raised enough money, it was too late. Sarah died while I was still negotiating his fee." Dakota had gone very still, his face a mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil underneath. "You blamed me for your wife's death." "I blamed myself," Nathaniel corrected fiercely. "But I also swore that my daughter would never die the way her mother did. When I learned that the famous Dr. Sterling had become Dakota Stormcloud hiding in these mountains, I saw an opportunity that felt like divine intervention." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with devastating clarity. Ayanna stared at her father with new understanding dawning in her dark eyes. "You didn't arrange this marriage to get rid of me," she whispered. "You arranged it to save my life." "The pregnancy complications you experienced," Nathaniel continued, his confession gathering momentum like a landslide. "The bleeding, the premature labor. Your mother had the same symptoms. Her pelvis was too narrow, her blood pressure too high. The local doctor said it was God's will when she died, but I knew better. I knew she died because we couldn't afford the best care." Dakota's professional mask finally cracked, revealing the emotional devastation underneath. "You put your daughter under my care because you believed I could save her from her mother's fate." "I researched everything about you," Nathaniel admitted. "Your specialization in obstetrics, your papers on difficult pregnancies, your success rate with high-risk deliveries, even your breakdown after the war. I understood that too. Good doctors carry the weight of every patient they lose." Dr. Goldfeather found his voice, though it shook with emotion. "Dear God, Nathaniel, you arranged your daughter's entire future around a medical consultation." "I arranged my daughter's survival," Nathaniel corrected. "Everything else was secondary." The revelation transformed every interaction they'd shared, every assumption they'd made about motivations and desires. Ayanna looked at Dakota with new eyes, understanding now that their marriage had been orchestrated not by a controlling father selling his daughter, but by a desperate man ensuring his child would have access to the medical expertise that might save her life. "The $2,000, Dakota said slowly. "That was my consulting fee, payment for providing obstetric care." "Payment for keeping my daughter alive," Nathaniel confirmed. "The ranch could go to hell, the cattle could die, the land could revert to sagebrush and rattlesnakes. None of that mattered if Ayanna lived to see her children grow up." Sheriff Blackfoot shook his head in amazement. "So this whole arrangement, the mountain marriage, the isolation, the reputation for being bought like livestock, it was all medical theater? It was all love?" Ayana said quietly, her hand moving to touch her sleeping son's tiny face. Different kinds of love, but love nonetheless. Dakota stood abruptly, pacing to the window where dawn light revealed a world transformed by snow and storm. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of professional obligation and personal revelation. "Your father made one critical error in his calculations," he said, not turning around. "He assumed that providing medical care would be sufficient. He didn't account for the possibility that I might actually come to love my patient." The confession fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples that touched everyone present. Ayana felt her breath catch as the full implications registered. "And he didn't account for the possibility that the patient might love her doctor in return," she said softly. Dakota turned from the window, his dark eyes holding depths of emotion that years of isolation hadn't quite extinguished. So the question becomes, what happens when a business arrangement becomes something else entirely? Nathaniel struggled to his feet, moving carefully to where his daughter sat with her newborn son. His weathered hands shook as he placed them on her shoulders. "Then you stop calling it a business arrangement," he said simply, "and you start calling it a marriage." The tiny baby stirred in his basket, making the soft mewling sounds of an infant testing his voice. 3 adults looked down at him, grandfather, mother, and the man who delivered him into the world against overwhelming odds. "What will you name him?" Dr. Goldfeather asked. Ayana looked at Dakota, then at her father, understanding finally that love could take many forms but always required the same courage. "Thomas Dakota Red Wolf," she said, "after his blood father and the man who saved his life." "After the father who loved his mother and the father who'll raise him," Dakota corrected gently. For the first time since the crisis began, Chief Nathaniel Red Wolf smiled. Spring arrived like a promise kept, melting the snow that had imprisoned them through the hardest winter any of them could remember. Thomas Dakota Red Wolf, now 5 months old and thriving beyond all medical expectations, had grown from a premature sparrow into a robust baby whose laughter echoed through the expanded cabin like music. His survival had been nothing short of miraculous, testament to Dakota's unwavering medical care and Ayana's fierce maternal devotion. The cabin itself had transformed over the winter months. What had begun as a bachelor's refuge had become a family home, with additions built during the brief warm spells between storms. Chief Nathaniel had insisted on contributing his own labor despite his heart condition, working alongside Dakota to expand the structure that would house 3 generations under one roof. "Reckon this is the finest medical facility between Denver and Salt Lake," Nathaniel observed one morning, watching Dakota examine baby Thomas with the gentle precision that had become as natural as breathing. The former Harvard surgeon had constructed an impressive array of medical equipment from frontier materials: improvised incubators, sterilization chambers, even a primitive but effective surgical suite in the cabin's newest addition. Ayana sat near the window, sunlight streaming through glass that Dakota had carefully installed to maximize natural light for medical procedures. Her recovery had been complete, her strength returning with the kind of resilience that seemed to run in her bloodline. More than that, she had found peace in a place she'd never expected to call home. "I've been thinking," she said, watching her husband. The words still carried a thrill of wonder as he carefully checked their son's reflexes and growth measurements. "About what comes next." Dakota looked up from his examination, his dark eyes holding the kind of contentment that years of isolation had convinced him he'd never experience. "What do you mean?" "I mean we have something here that the territory needs," Ayana continued, her voice gaining strength with conviction. "Medical expertise, yes, but more than that. We have proof that different worlds can come together and create something better than either could achieve alone." The truth of her words was evident everywhere they looked. Chief Nathaniel, his business acumen combined with Dakota's medical knowledge, had already begun planning a legitimate medical practice that could serve the scattered communities throughout the region. Dr. Goldfeather, humbled by witnessing skills that far exceeded his own, had proposed a partnership that would bring modern medical techniques to frontier settlements that had never seen anything more sophisticated than folk remedies and prayer. "What are you proposing?" Dakota asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew the direction of her thoughts. "A teaching hospital," Ayanna said simply. "Not grand like the ones back east, but something that fits this country and these people. A place where native healing traditions can work alongside modern medicine. Where young doctors can learn to treat everything from gunshot wounds to difficult pregnancies. Where women like me can learn enough medical skills to help their communities when professional doctors aren't available." The vision she painted was ambitious beyond anything they'd dared imagine during those desperate winter months. But as Dakota considered her words, he began to see the possibilities that her educator's mind had already mapped out. "The territorial governor's been talking about funding for medical education," Nathaniel added, his businessman's instincts recognizing opportunity when it presented itself. Political pressure from Washington to improve health care in the territories. A teaching hospital run by a Harvard-trained physician with actual frontier experience would attract serious attention. Dr. Goldfeather nodded enthusiastically from his seat by the fire. The medical college in Denver has been seeking partnerships with rural practitioners. A formal affiliation could provide funding, supplies, even visiting professors during the summer months. But it was Sheriff Blackfoot who provided the most compelling argument. "Word's already spreading about what happened here during the blizzard," he said. "How Dr. Sterling, Dakota, saved 3 lives under conditions that would have defeated most physicians. People are talking about the mountain doctor who can work miracles with nothing but skill and determination." Dakota was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between his wife, his son, and the man he'd come to consider a father-in-law rather than merely a business partner. The isolation that had once seemed like necessary healing now felt like selfish indulgence. He possessed skills that could save lives, knowledge that could be passed on to others, experience that could bridge the gap between academic medicine and frontier reality. "There would be conditions," he said finally. "Any teaching hospital we establish would serve everyone equally, Native American, white settler, Mexican immigrant, everyone. No one gets turned away because of their race or their ability to pay." "Agreed," Nathaniel said immediately. "In fact, that principle should be written into our charter. Make it legally binding." "And we maintain our privacy up here," Dakota continued. "The hospital can be built in Silver Creek or wherever makes sense, but this cabin remains our home, our sanctuary." Ayanna smiled, understanding the importance of preserving the place where their unlikely family had been forged. "The teaching hospital would be our public service," she said. "But this mountain would be our private refuge." As if sensing the momentous nature of the conversation, Baby Thomas chose that moment to wake from his nap with a lusty cry that proclaimed his presence to the world. Dakota lifted his son with the same careful precision he brought to all his medical procedures, but the expression on his face was pure paternal love. "What do you think, little man?" he murmured to the baby. "Ready to help your parents change the world?" Thomas responded by grasping Dakota's finger with surprising strength, his dark eyes so like his mother's, wide and alert as he studied the face of the man he would grow up knowing as father. The months that followed were a whirlwind of planning, correspondence, and construction. The territorial government, indeed eager to demonstrate progress in frontier healthcare, provided funding for a modest but well-equipped medical facility in Silver Creek. The building rose quickly, designed by Dakota with input from physicians he'd known during his Harvard days and adapted to the realities of mountain weather and frontier logistics. More importantly, students began arriving, young doctors seeking practical experience, established physicians wanting to learn Dakota's innovative techniques for treating trauma and pregnancy complications, even traditional healers from various tribal communities who saw an opportunity to share knowledge that had been preserved for generations. Ayanna found herself at the center of it all, her natural teaching abilities enhanced by her intimate understanding of both worlds the hospital was meant to serve. She developed curricula that combined medical theory with practical application, created training programs for midwives and medical assistants, and established protocols that ensured every patient received care regardless of their background or circumstances. Chief Nathaniel, his health stabilized under Dakota's ongoing care, discovered a new calling as the hospital's administrator. His business skills, combined with his deep understanding of territorial politics, proved invaluable in securing continued funding and navigating the complex relationships between government officials, tribal leaders, and frontier communities. By Thomas's first birthday, the Silver Creek Teaching Hospital had become a model for frontier medical education, attracting visitors from across the territory and earning recognition from medical institutions as far away as Boston and Philadelphia. But more importantly to the family on the mountain, it had proven that love and skill combined could indeed change the world. The celebration of Thomas's birthday took place at the cabin with the entire extended family, medical students, local physicians, tribal elders, and territorial officials, gathering to honor not just the child's survival, but the miraculous transformation that had grown from a desperate father's scheme to save his daughter's life. As evening settled over the mountains and their guests prepared to depart, Dakota and Ayanna stood together on their porch, watching the sun set over valleys that now knew hope where once there had been only hardship. "Do you ever regret it?" Ayanna asked softly, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Giving up your isolation for all this responsibility?" Dakota was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the certainty of a man who had found his true calling. "I spent 10 years hiding from life because I was afraid of losing patients, afraid of failing people who trusted me with their lives," he said. "But I learned something important during that blizzard when your father was dying and you were in labor and our son was fighting to breathe." "What did you learn?" "That healing isn't about never losing anyone. It's about fighting for every life with everything you have and finding the courage to keep fighting even when you know some battles can't be won." Thomas stirred in his mother's arms, making the soft sounds of a contented baby surrounded by love and security. In the distance, wolves called to each other across the valleys, their voices carrying ancient songs of survival and family. "Besides," Dakota added with a smile that transformed his weathered features, "isolation was just another kind of death. This, our family, our work, our life together, this is what living actually looks like." As stars emerged in the darkening sky above the Colorado mountains, 3 generations of an unlikely family settled into the peace that comes from knowing that love, in all its forms, had finally found its way home. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to the best years of your life. When Chief Nathaniel Red Wolf faced losing everything, his daughter, his ranch, his legacy, he made a choice that looked like betrayal, but was actually the deepest expression of a father's love. Just like many of us who've reached this season of life, he discovered that protecting the people we love sometimes means making decisions that others don't understand. Dakota and Ayanna's story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, that families can be built from the most unlikely circumstances, and that the greatest healing often comes after our deepest wounds. Their mountain cabin became a symbol of what's possible when we stop running from our past and start building something meaningful for the future. In our golden years, we have the wisdom to recognize that love isn't always wrapped in pretty packages. Sometimes it comes disguised as difficult choices, unexpected partnerships, and the courage to trust when trust seems impossible. The teaching hospital they built together proves that our later chapters can be our most purposeful ones, where everything we've learned finally comes together to serve something greater than ourselves. What unexpected blessing emerged from the most difficult period of your life? Have you ever discovered that someone's harsh decision was actually an act of love in disguise? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what another reader needs to hear today.